Good afternoon. Welcome everyone who joined us. The Ukraine Media Center continues its work. We'll talk now about the crimes of the Russian Federation against our cultural heritage. Our speaker today is Kateryna Chuieva. She is Deputy Minister for Culture and Information Policy. We know that many crimes have been committed already. What does the Ukrainian state do in order to protect our cultural heritage, and how our international partners are helping us? Thank you for coming. I'd like to first say something about our general statistics and the key directions of work. Can you launch my presentation? So, a bit of statistics. We are updating it every day, and by today, 492 or even 493 episodes of destruction of cultural objects are verified, and we can publish this figure now. The crimes of the Russian Federation have been verified on the territory of 14 oblasts and also in the city of Kyiv. As you see, the most of them were committed in Donetsk Oblast, then Kharkiv Oblast, then Luhansk, and Kyiv Oblast, Chernihiv Oblast, and others. And there are also individual destructions and ruinations in Vinnytsia Oblast, in Dnipropetrovsk, and in Kyiv. The statistics does not become better. We are now verifying several other objects. As a rule, we get information from the regions, or our specialists find this information, check the data, and check whether this object is a memorable place of cultural heritage. And as you know, there are different registers. And when they establish all these details, they check the address and the other details, and after this, the object goes into the database and is being published on our site. As of today, as we see, religious buildings have been mostly hit. We are working with the State Service for Religious and Ethnic Affairs. They compile their own statistics, and sometimes we have to compare information that we get and they get from different sources. As according to our statistics now, 166 religious buildings were destroyed or damaged, and 77 out of them are historical monuments or cultural monuments. I must tell you that not all objects on our list are the objects of cultural heritage. Next week, I am sure we will have to talk about more than 500 such objects, and 140 of those objects are objects of cultural heritage. Then there are monuments of architecture and city building. 23 of them are of the national significance. Also, some that have been just discovered as cultural objects and cultural heritage objects. There's a hierarchy to those statuses, and 129 objects of valuable historical construction. We classify in this category those objects which are not considered monuments, but this, under such sad circumstances, helps us see how much we will have to do in order to see all the objects that are valuable for the history of Ukraine, for the history of Ukraine's culture, some other statistics as well. 52 memorial monuments dedicated to different historical figures and events of the 19th or the beginning of the 21st century were damaged or ruined. Among them, some monuments to the anti-terrorist operation warriors, also more than 30 buildings of museums and preserves, and other important buildings. Not all the institutions of culture are placed in historical monuments. Some of those buildings are modern buildings. However, this does not ache us less. They all are part of the Ukrainian culture. So we decided to document all the ruinations and damages, and then we will use this in order to develop the programs of restoration. Some regional statistics as well. 17 objects in Donetsk, Kyiv, and Sumy oblasts were razed from the face of the earth, and we still do not know the aggregate number. And there's unknown situation with some objects, which means that we cannot reach them physically and cannot check this information. There are no photos or no videos of some of them, and we will have to establish this on site. And for us, of course, a great challenge is the monitoring of archaeological heritage, because as a rule the ruination of archaeological heritage takes place where combat rages and we do not have access to these objects. So we are working with the responsible departments and the agencies in order to be able to document and to avoid such ruinations. 99 objects were severely damaged, which means that their restoration will last for very long, and of course they will demand a very serious attitude. And these buildings are almost totally ruined, and the destruction is so hard that you cannot repair it quickly. You'll have to allocate quite a lot of money and resource to restoring this. 178 objects were hit to a middle level, and this means that they have a chance to be preserved, and 184 were lightly hit. This means that some windows were broken, and they are not critical to the structure, and they may lead to replacing some material valuables that were held there, and that people still may work there, like in some houses of culture in Kyiv Oblast, for instance. We call upon you to send more information about the ruination of the cultural heritage objects or other objects that you deem valuable from the point of view of history and culture. And this is very, very important because, of course, all the state bodies are working to collect the maximum amount of information, but sometimes both our ministry and state bodies in situ have no resource to check on all the possible ruinations. So please, every public activist, every volunteer who go across Ukraine, see different monuments and museums, please send information for our database. This may be very brief information, some basic data that may allow us to document that there's a ruination or damage and then we will check this and actually include into the database. I emphasize that without such help, even our novel technology cannot provide a full picture. We have to amalgamate information from different sources. And in connection with this, I'll go to the next part of our briefing. We are working with a number of international and public organizations in order to maximally gather the information about ruinations and damages and have in place the process of documenting of crimes. There are different protocols applied to this. One of the protocols is the protocol that we need and the bodies of protection of cultural heritage in order to estimate the amount of the damage done and to develop the first turn events and measures that we have to apply and to work further later with the projects of restoration of those complexes that were hit, and then making putting the crimes on file. In this respect, we very much have to cooperate with the international organizations and foreign organizations because Ukraine, up to the date, has not seen such a scale of ruination since the Second World War. But now we have widespread ruination of our cultural objects, and we have to work with international experts whose organizations have relevant experience. So we try to coordinate all these processes, and when it is possible to conduct both processes simultaneously, we do this in order to, again, collect as much information as possible and then pass them on to international court bodies. And of course, what you can see here is just a tip of the iceberg, which can be used by the media, which can be used in order to calculate the damage, but it still does not reflect the entire amount of the data that we have. And this applies to many, many war crimes. Colleagues from different countries help us very much. We'll talk in more detail about this some other time, but now I'll tell you that we are exceptionally grateful to all the countries that sent assistance to our cultural establishments, including museums and archives and libraries and theaters. This is all the humanitarian aid from our international partners that started from the very start of the war. It has two aspects: a diplomatic aspect, when the colleagues are applying efforts so that their governments or organizations adopt some decisions. And the second aspect is, of course, delivering this humanitarian aid here, including respirators and fire protection equipment and all this. This is very important for our cultural objects because when the war started, it turned out that Ukrainians independently have great difficulties in providing for this safety. And we continue to work so that this help arrives. And a part of this, very significant part here, is communication with our foreign colleagues. And one of the latest communication steps was our work at the International Federation of Museums in Prague. I was able to go there for just 2 days. As a rule, this is quite a joyful event to people from all over the world because this is a opportunity to see something like 4,000 or 5,000 people from different countries. This is a huge program of international exchange, very efficient. However, in our case, both, like in 2014, we had to talk about the ruination that Russia inflicted upon Ukraine, and some speeches of Ukrainian colleagues, including also mine, of Vasil Ryzhko, who is the coordinator of the staff for saving cultural heritage, which is being coordinated by the ministry, Olga Gonchara, Olesa Milovanova, and other colleagues, including those from the eastern parts of Ukraine who luckily had an opportunity to come to Prague with the support of our foreign colleagues. They were able to present their data gathered during the war, and we could not, of course, omit the participation of Russia in this international organization. We have raised the issue of expelling Russia from international cultural bodies, but of course this is very complicated because there are democratic procedures there. However, the International Council of Museums has already launched the process of removing Russia from its members, including by means of sticking to the International Code of Museum Ethics. We talked a lot with the colleagues about this, and at the same conference, a very long-awaited for change was adopted at this conference pertaining to the entire international community. This is the new definition of a museum. The discussion lasted for at least 6 hours. There's a lot of changes going on in the world, and the definition which was adopted 15 years ago can be reviewed and has to be refused. I do not translate it into Ukrainian, that a museum is not for-profit, permanent institution in the service of society that researches, collects, conserves, interprets, and exhibits tangible and intangible heritage, open to the public, accessible, and inclusive. Museums are working to strengthen the diversity and resilience and sustainability of societies. They operate and communicate in an ethic and professional way, and with the participation of communities, offering different experiences for learning, reflection, and dissemination of knowledge, sharing knowledge, because this is one of the functions. We haven't been able to make an official Ukrainian translation, but now the function of museums, which was the de facto, is now included in a document, and we will think about introducing this notion into the Ukrainian legislation, because the ministry is preparing quite a lot of changes, and we are already in the process of changing our active legislative documents in the cultural sphere. Coming back to the ruination of our cultural heritage, you said that 24 objects are still not defined as monuments. What is the level of cooperation with local self-government bodies? Because we understand that they are owners of very important information, even if they are not on their territory. Yes, of course, we have such cooperation, but in the specific direction of documenting the damage, we want to review it and strengthen this aspect, because in the first months of the after the 24th of February, the situation was very difficult, and we understood that local self-government bodies were overloaded with solving immediate social issues. Now, at the deoccupied territories, we can work with local self-governments in a systemic way. We will collect different official documents, and we will establish regular monitoring so that it is being done everywhere around Ukraine, in all the oblasts. Up to this date, the major part of information came from public organizations, and sometimes there was no time to check it thoroughly. Now we hope for better cooperation with them. Do we have a form, an established money foundation, money fund to restore our cultural heritage? It is too early to talk about this within the framework of the budget process, because, as you know, it is only being formed for the next year. There's a number of negotiations going on with different bodies, because, you know, our territory cannot be 100% safe against missile hits, and our partners have a lot of questions about whether what they do won't be leveled to zero as a result of Russian attacks. So the work is broken into two phases. Restoration as such, especially when there are complicated buildings, especially strongly damaged. This is a very long-term process, because you have to comprehensively examine those objects. You have to develop a comprehensive plan to restore them, so we have to conserve and preserve them for the moment, so that they at least survive through the next cold and wet season, and only after this the issue of restoration will come to the fore. So we are now in the process of negotiations with the Unesco, and you know, this money is not as big as for the full-scale restoration, but for preservation or conservation, we shall have this money until the full-scale projects are developed. Dmitro, Ukrinform, what is the mechanism of protecting the cultural heritage where combat is going on? If we're talking about architectural or historical heritage, the maximum that we may do is to avoid damages. Regrettably, there are no protocols that allow for 100% protection of a big historical monument. What our colleagues are doing is minimizing negative after effects, like using the sandbags or installing protective constructions. These structures, this is all to minimize the after effects, but you cannot protect them, because you cannot protect the monument against a missile if it hits directly. Of course, we are talking separately about movables. Some of the museum collections were displaced, they were evacuated, they were hidden, but we do not comment this in more detail. I'm very much worried about whether we will be able to take Russians to responsibility so that they pay for the restoration of all this. We're working on this, because this is a whole set of issues. that have to go through all the stages and procedures. The most acute thing now is to correctly document all those ruinations and destructions and damages so that international bodies can apply respective procedures to this. I think that my colleagues from law enforcement bodies may comment on this, but we are taking some steps and the criminal cases are being launched. And we hope that in the final count we will be able to pass on these cases and they will be taken for consideration. Thank you very much. Kateryna Chuieva, Deputy Minister for Culture and Information Policy, was with us. Thank you, Kateryna. Thank you, everyone who is with us. We're developing the schedule for tomorrow. Please watch us and be with us. Goodbye.